everybody. I'm Chief Meteorologist and Hurricane Specialist Ivan Cabrera here with meteorologist Cindy Pressler and meteorologist Dave Warren. It is now August. We are into the month where things really ramp up as far as hurricane activity, and so we wanted to give you an update on where things stand, if any signals have changed that we look at to forecast what's going to be ahead over the next peak months of hurricane season, and we'll go through a bunch of things that I think have been so far quite interesting across the Atlantic. But just to recap things as far as where we are, we're getting into that peak season. We start obviously in June and July, where we had a flurry of activity. We had Brett and your namesake, Cindy. Yep. Very unusual to have something out in the eastern Atlantic like that. We call it the main development region, and we'll chat a lot about that, the MDR. So we had that first flurry, then we haven't had much activity, and then now look at the peak here. From August 1 to September 1st, we just almost climb vertically, and there's a good reason for that as conditions have become more favorable for storms to develop in the whole Atlantic basin, not just some areas. We first start in the Caribbean Gulf, and then we expand out this time of year. So there we are, Arlene, Brett, Cindy, and we've had our first hurricane. What did you think of Don out there?
It happened so quick. It went right over the Gulf Stream, right out in the middle of the Atlantic, 20 days before August 11th, when we typically get our first hurricane. So it was brief, but it was there. Yeah,
I think most people wouldn't even think that we've had a hurricane so far. Don was the thing that was spinning up. Cindy and I have been following that like every day. It was like, is this going to be the end? No, it just hung in there, and then it finally got enough wind speed, maximum winds, that it was classified a hurricane. Arlene, that was interesting, right? That was a lot of heavy rain, and then we had those weird storms of Brett and Cindy that we can typically see off of cold fronts that can develop along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf, but something as far out as the Cabo Verde Islands, and it just went. They both went and had favorable conditions to develop.
Overall, though, I think we're pretty fortunate that we haven't seen anything that has threatened any kind of land so far. That certainly is good news. But remember last year?
Yes, every season is different. And, you know, it's so interesting. We'll talk about these forecasts and the signals that we look at here, but we always end, you know, saying the same thing. It only takes one. And, you know, the El Nino's getting going, which favors below normal cyclone activity. But I'll never forget, 92 was an El Nino year, and our first storm late in August, obviously Andrew. So you know, every season is definitely different. So far, this is what we typically see. You know, when we look back at the last 30 years, we typically get 14 named storms. Half of those become hurricanes, and then out of those 7, 3 become major hurricanes, so Cat 3 or higher. Let's talk about the forecast so far, Cindy, as far as what NOAA's put out.
You know, we continually get updates out of this, but we at the beginning thought it was going to be a less active season.
Right.
That's the way everything was pointing. That was the ingredients that we had. But as we get deeper and deeper now through July and now into August, those warm sea surface temperatures, that seems to be the big prevailing element that we think is going to push this season just a little bit higher.
Right. And El Nino is a word, you know, people are familiar with, La Nina as well. You know, it's just one of the signals that we look at. There are a lot of other things like sea surface temperatures that can have a big impact on what kind of season we get. The forecast from NOAA, you know, it's a big range. We get that, you know, 12 to 17. So I like this range because it just gives you an idea of, you know, how not 100% these forecasts are. You know, you can end up with 12 or you can end up with 17. If you end up with 12, it's below average, 17 is above average, so something in the middle. So these can be a little bit tricky. Obviously, the more storms that form, the higher the chances that a landmass will get hit, but it's, you know, it's not a guarantee. So as we head into August, guys, let's talk about this feature here that we look at through the now getting into the peak season.
Right, so this is where we see typically storms originate, and it's pretty much everywhere. Now we're really seeing the warm water. We've highlighted the areas, though, where we typically see the storms come in, right through that main development region, and they typically track to the west. And there is also a little activity that can develop right off the east coast here. So these are the areas to watch mainly. They're between Cabo Verde and the Lesser Antilles there, but right through that main development
And you
region.
see that pocket there of deeper red. Climatologically speaking, when we look back at the last 30 years, most of the storms, most of the hurricanes, in fact, have developed east of the Lesser Antilles, which is an area we're familiar with, obviously, and we look at very closely. And that darker color off the eastern seaboard, a lot of the storms sometimes can develop off of fronts. Sometimes, they'll go around that Bermuda high. So picture the high being here, and we get that clockwise flow around it. And so the storms tend to go north. It's rarer for them to completely make a beeline towards, the Bahamas, Cuba, and into Florida. If that high strengthens, then these arrows, can curve a little bit. So, but generally speaking, this is how we fare during the month of August. And of course, we start in June and July, just primarily looking at the Gulf and into the Caribbean. So it's a huge area, right? So we go from roughly 10 to 20 degrees as far as the latitudes here, but we go from Africa all the way now into the Caribbean. So let's talk about why this area, guys, is so, it is called the main development region as conditions become more favorable here. So one of the things that we look at so far, one of the ingredients is the dust, right, that is coming off Africa. Let's talk about how so far that's fared with the storms that we've been seeing.
We've had so much dust out in the Atlantic, and we've had it over Florida, which has been good.
They do call it a Saharan dust season here.
Correct.
So like July, and sometimes it can lead right into August, but we still have a little bit out there, and it really kind of suppresses everything. Very dry, dusty air. We see it come over here to South Florida sometimes. We've had some this season.
Dust is a good thing when it comes to the tropics. Not such a good thing for those of us that have breathing issues, but that dust works well out in the tropics.
And it, the way a tropical storm begins, the way a hurricane begins, it's just a cluster of thunderstorms. Just like when we talk about this air, the Saharan air, and the dust getting to us, sometimes we have rain chances down to 0 or 10. It's the same reason here with this cluster of thunderstorm activity, these easterly waves that we talk about. If they ingest this dry air, which they do if they're moving in that direction, they could really just not just inhibit development, but any development that tries to get going just get squashed rather quickly. So you see these robust waves sometimes coming off Africa, and you're thinking, oh, this is going to be something, but the Saharan dust takes care of it. The issue is, though, now we're getting past the peak of the season.
Starts to thin out.
And the concentration of the dust starts to thin out, and so now things become more favorable, which is why we have the MDR. What are we looking at here, guys? The shear.
Wind shear. That's the winds that work against a system.
Right, they change direction with height. They can rip apart storms, but if there's no shear, then that's favorable conditions.
Right, and we'll talk about, so the thunderstorms try to rise into the atmosphere, and as you think of like this giant fan, which is the wind shear blowing the tops off of the thunderstorms, it just physically disrupts that process of tropical cycles. Tropical storms, hurricanes, they love areas of high pressure on top of them. That means generally quiet conditions, so they can really become the efficient heat engine that they are. And to be an efficient heat engine, we get this, right?
Yep.
Sea surface temperatures. We've been looking at these numbers, something we haven't seen this early in the season.
This has been a big story this entire summer. These temperatures are off the charts hot, and that heat goes all the way into the North Atlantic. So what is that going to do to our season?
Yeah, even the warm, right, the question is will El Nino and create more wind shear to offset that, or will we look at these unseasonably warm water temperatures?
And this will take us now to the competing signals. So let's just recap what El Nino is. There's South America, there's the equatorial Pacific, and so you see that bubble of orange there. Those are temperatures that are above average for sea surface temperatures for this time of year. So when you get that strip like that, that is a classic El Nino. In fact, the NOAA has put out an El Nino advisory. It was a watch earlier in the season, now officially an advisory, because obviously an El Nino has developed. El Nino is important with hurricanes and any tropical system because typically for our neck of the woods here in the northern hemisphere, western hemisphere, we tend to see hostile winds that develop. And as Cindy was talking about, these thunderstorms that try to get going can be disrupted by these very strong winds that set up, and the storms try to get going, but then all of a sudden, there it is. The winds just kind of lop off the top of the storms and inhibit development. So let's talk about a little bit about these two things. So we have the sea surface temperatures, super warm. That's a plus for hurricanes. They like that. But then we also have the wind shear that's going to develop. So my question is, with these above average temperatures, are we going to generate a lot of tropical waves that could become tropical depression storms, but then they'll reach the Caribbean and then get, lopped off by the wind shear? So now all of a sudden we're
trying to work against it here,
right,
because the water's warm, but we have El Nino. So this is what it could mean for us in maybe towards the Caribbean here.
Right.
We have average wind shear, but warmer ocean temperatures. So we're trying to see a little more wind shear develop with El Nino. Could that disrupt the storms? That's something to watch.
Yeah, if we have average wind shear, that's not a good thing. We want strong wind shear, and for strong wind shear, you get a strong El Nino. But is that going to be enough to overcome what we've been talking about here, which is really just pocket of very warm sea surface temperatures, that energy that the hurricanes feed off of? We've also had a very wet and vigorous monsoon season here across West Africa, and that does two things. It has generated a lot of dust to the north of that, so it picks up all that Saharan dust and pushes it out into the Atlantic, which is a good thing. That suppresses tropical development here. But then you've got a very healthy monsoon, so you get these tropical waves that will come off the continent there and will continue to provide the seeds for what ends up being, a tropical storm or hurricane.
These storms are normal. This is
right,
natural. This is what we get all the time, right? These
right,
are not something different that we've had over the past 5 years. They always have been coming off of Africa, but it's what happens out here in the water.
Right.
That's that strong water that acts like jet fuel once
right,
those temperatures are above 80
it
degrees.
Is, and that's exactly what it is. And it's so interesting, every season is different. So we have competing signals here. So I think the NOAA forecast is right on the money. It could be a below average season if El Nino really ramps up, and if it can overcome, the positives of having such warm sea surface temperatures, or if it's more average El Nino and the wind shear is not significant, the sea surface temperatures will breed stronger storms, and then there'll be really not much to stop them once they get closer to the U.S. and other land masses in the Caribbean.
I guess we're just saying stay tuned.
A lot to watch.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we'll let you know.
And we'll keep you posted. NOAA will have an update through the middle part of the season, but right now, looking good, at least for the next couple of weeks. That will always change, and we'll keep you ahead of the storm. Thanks for watching.